And now, without further ado, here she is from Albuquerque and places much farther away in space and time, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Well, I'll tell you, those first 2 weeks of June of 2012 were one of the most extraordinary days in my entire life as I and a group traveled from Istanbul going southeastward toward Gobekli Tepe, that is 12,000 years old by carbon dating. And as the sun rose on Wednesday, June 13th, I was standing on the Gobekli Tepe hilltop in southern Turkey, not far from the Syrian northern border. Carbon dated too, 12,000 years ago. Gobekli is older than Egypt, Sumeria, classical Greeks, and Stonehenge. Ramps have been built to walk around the archaeological excavations of mysterious 16 to 19 foot tall, elegantly carved limestone pillars placed carefully in circular patterns. There are at least 30 acres of these pillar circles 1,000 feet above the valley floor. Each pillar weighs 7 to 10 tons. Many are sculpted with odd, even unrecognizable animals, insects, and humanoid figures. A few unfinished pillars have been found that are 23 to 30 feet long, much larger than any of the finished standing pillars found so far. There is evidence that the pillars were roofed and that the central pair of tallest pillars may have supported a roof. The floors are made of burnt lime known as terrazzo. On June 13th at sunrise, I faced the sun and then turned 180 degrees to face the opposite point in the west. Below me was a large pillar, anciently cemented to a rectangular base that looks like an altar. On that altar pillar is a long-bodied animal that does not quite match any known earth animal today. With the sun shining on my back, feeling that warmth, that pillar animal was facing me on an east-west axis. Then to my right was another large pillar, also mounted on a rectangular base. That second altar pillar also faces the sun on an east-west axis, and it has two long arms stretching down along the broad sides of the pillar around another animal, maybe a fox, that has a shorter body and shorter tail. The arms end in fingers that clasp the pillar. Below the hands is a band of symbols that to date have not been translated. And along the base of that rectangular altar are 5 strange bird-like creatures that are not identified either. I was there with Boston University geologist Robert M. Schoch, Ph.D., his wife Katie, and their Turkish tour team of Gregory Poplawski and Jack Jakubowski from Poland, and their Turkish guide Swat. They led our group of about 40 Americans from Istanbul through many other ancient Greek, Roman, and Byzantine archaeological sites as we traveled southeastward to Gobekli during those first 2 weeks of June. Gobekli Tepe in Turkish means a pot-belly hill, first studied in a 1964 survey by Istanbul University and University of Chicago scientists. And they concluded the hill could not be entirely natural. But it was not until 1994 that German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, Ph.D., began excavating layer by layer, carefully dating and studying the surrounding soils as he dug. To his surprise, Dr. Schmidt did not find evidence of cooking hearths, no houses, no trash pits, and no clay fertility figurines. He found some stone hammers and blades, but no specific tools that could explain how the extraordinary three-dimensional sculptures were made. Eventually, Dr. Schmidt called Gobekli Tepe a 12,000-year-old cathedral on a hill without knowing who made it or why. Since 1994, only 5% of the limestone pillar circles have been uncovered. According to ground-penetrating radar, there might be at least 250 more standing pillars formed in at least 18 more circles still buried under an additional 22-some acres of deep soil. All of this built 12,000 years ago and then carefully reburied 1,000 years later. Smithsonian Magazine reporter Andrew Curry visited Gobekli Tepe and wrote, quote, "What was so important to these early people that they gathered to build and bury these stone rings? The gulf that separates us from Gobekli Tepe's builders is almost unimaginable. Indeed, though I stood among the looming megaliths eager to take in their meaning, they didn't speak to me. They were utterly foreign, placed there by people who saw the world in a way I will never comprehend," close quote. Just how certain are the scientists who have studied the Gobekli Tepe site about its age and reburial 1,000 years after the pillars were so carefully placed in circles over the 30-acre hilltop? Well, here now is my discussion about that question with Professor Robert Schoch, Ph.D. geologist from Boston University.
Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, he's been doing absolutely meticulous studies. He's been excavating layer by layer very carefully, very precisely, which is one reason it's been taking him so long, years and years, just to uncover the area he's uncovered so far. Something he's doing is literally peeling back the layers. And this is important from my point of view as a geologist and stratigrapher, because how a site is covered over, how the dirt is stratified, how the dirt is layered, how it's jumbled versus layered is very, very important for figuring out the history of that site. So I was very convinced that his scenario of it being purposefully covered over is absolutely the case. And as he's peeling away these layers, he's been sampling. So he samples the different layers. He samples different material in the different layers. You can sample material that the layers are composed of. So you find bits of charcoal and bone and other types of material that has carbon in it. So this is useful for carbon dating, radiometric dating, radiocarbon dating. So if you find a piece of bone, for instance, or a piece of charcoal in the material that was used to fill in the site, you can date that. That essentially dates the material that was used to fill it in. The second major point is that once it is covered over with the material, you start to form soil, you start to have natural processes taking place that, for instance, will dissolve out some of the calcite. There's a lot of limestone in this area. A lot of the debris and rubble is limestone or has calcite in it. The major pillars are made out of calcite. Calcite dissolves with rainwater. It dissolves slowly but quite perceptibly. If anyone's looked at, for instance, a very old cathedral, they may see how it looks like the limestone looks like it's melting. So it actually dissolves, and then it reprecipitates out. You see this in caves all the time with the formation of stalactites and stalagmites. That's calcite that's dissolving from the rock and reprecipitating out. Now, this happens in the case of Gobekli Tepe in the soils that form in the layer of rubble, the layer of overburden that was used to cover it over. So this starts forming after it's covered over, as it forms soil, as it's rained on, and the calcite itself can be carbon dated. And by carbon dating that, we can get a fix on when it was completely covered over, because this will start forming after it's completely covered over, and it takes some time also. It takes at least a couple of centuries and continues to form.
I understand that Dr. Klaus Schmidt says that the refill happened approximately 8,800 BC, about 1,000 years after the pillars were first erected.
Yes, that sounds correct, because what you do is you estimate that based on this calcite reprecipitating, these minerals forming, and they will form at a certain time, but it takes time for them to form, so the date you get on those minerals is actually later than when it was initially refilled. Mm-hmm. So we can be very confident, I believe, looking at all the data, having discussed it with him on site, that it was covered over in the 9th millennium BC, as you just said. which is an incredible amount of time from the present. We're talking 10,000 plus years ago, and we know that it was completely covered over, and then we know that it was used for 1,000 or more years before that. So this is really pushing the date of Gobekli Tepe way back geologically to the end of the last ice age, pushing it back to 12,000 years. And this is just what's exposed. This is just what's been uncovered. I actually wonder, and I'm speculating here, that as more of the site is uncovered, could some of the stone circles be even older? Could they go back even further than 12,000 years ago?
And that is at least 7,000 years older than the academically acceptable 5,000 years ago Sumerian Mesopotamian alleged beginning of civilization.
Yes, exactly. And I like the way you said it because it's 7,000 years older than the accepted 5,000 years ago. So that's more than double. Put it this way, when the Sumerians and the early dynastic Egyptians were first doing their thing, Gobekli Tepe was already older to them than they are to us.
That's right. And is it fair to say that no one knows of any human culture 12,000 years ago that would have had the sophistication and the ability to create the 30 acres of tall, standing, elegantly proportioned and carved pillars?
The way you said it, I think that's a fair statement because they exist. Those pillars are there, those enclosures are there, but we don't have any independent evidence of this culture or this civilization elsewhere.
And that goes to the question of what was the purpose of Gobekli Tepe and all of the pillars in the first place. Some people have been suggesting that stone circles on the planet may have played in some kind of frequency, resonance, sound, like machines all over the planet, including Stonehenge.
Mm-hmm.
If there was some kind of frequency or resonance role for all of these standing pillars in circles over the 30 acres of the original standing pillars at Gobekli Tepe, and then 1,000 years later it all gets covered up, was the machine then stopped? And as the excavation goes forward to 2012 and beyond, could it be that Gobekli Tepe and all of those pillars are coming back into perhaps some kind of function?
I don't know. I mean, certainly if we think of it that way, those pillars are set up in a way that really boggles the imagination. They're very tall, they're very flat, they're very thin. They are set into the stone floor in such a way that in my assessment, they're not so much set to just be stable and chunky and sort of stout. They're long, thin, they're rising up from the surface. They actually strike me as sort of like tuning forks, that they would vibrate. And it has been suggested by other researchers, too, that they may have actually been intended, among other things, to vibrate or to hum. So this is incredibly sophisticated. And I could imagine that these circles humming or vibrating when they were at their peak, when they were first made. So that may have affected consciousness levels, but I think the point is well taken that in some ways you could see it as a machine. You could see these stone enclosures as machines. And that doesn't preclude, in my opinion, other functions for them simultaneously. Once you cover them over, that would stop it.
Right.
But when you uncover them, as you suggest, could they start up again?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's mystery upon mystery.
It's a mystery upon mystery, yes.
Well, Free Dreamland listeners, we'll be back in just a moment.